Hi, everyone. Hi. Okay, I'm Jenny. I work at Books Are Magic with the events team. We're just about to get started, but before Jenny and I'll come out, I'm just going to go over some housekeeping and ground rules for you all. So first off, we'll be doing an audience hand-raised Q&A towards the end of the event, so start thinking of questions to ask now or raise your hand when the time comes. Jenny or I will repeat your questions into their mics to ensure that viewers on the live stream can hear as well. After the talk tonight, Jenny will be signing and personalizing books at the alcove right next to the register at the front of the store. And if you're joining us from the YouTube live stream, we'd love to encourage you to buy a copy of Holding Pattern online using the link in the live stream description. Okay, so tonight I'm excited to introduce Jenny and Isle, who are here to discuss Jenny's debut novel, Holding Pattern. In Holding Pattern, Kathleen Chang has blown up her life. She's gone through a breakup, dropped out of her graduate program, and left everything behind. She's now back in her childhood home, surprised to know that her mother isn't the same person she remembers. Instead, she's sporty, perky, and in love. After taking a job at a startup that specializes in touch-based therapy, Kathleen begins negotiating new ideas about intimacy and connection, rethinking her relationship with her mom. As Kathleen and her mom peel back the layers of their history, they must come to a new understanding of how they can propel each other forward and how they've held each other back. Holding Pattern is a hopeful novel about immigration and belonging, mother-daughter relationships, and the many ways in which we learn to hold each other. Jenny is a National Book Foundation 5 Under 35 honoree. Her short fiction has appeared in Ninth Letter, Joyland, Narrative, and more. Her writing on design, culture, and travel has been featured in The Atlantic, The Washington Post, Architectural Digest, and Dwell, the latter of which she was previously the executive editor. And as I mentioned a moment ago, Isle is here to discuss Holding Pattern with Jenny. Isle was named one of the Strand's 30 writers to watch, and their debut novel, The Atmospherians, was named a New York Times editor choice. Their second novel, People Collide, publishes in September. So without further delay, everyone please give a very warm welcome to Jenny and Isle.
Hi. We had an idea.
It's
we had an idea to have a walkout song.
Yeah.
And we chose Sleepyhead by Passion Pit.
Yeah.
For no particular reason, but Indie Sleaze is back.
It's back. Yeah, this is the night of sleaze.
Yes.
And Holding. I should give you your book.
Yes, I do need my book. Sleaze and Holding. Thank you for saying that. Also, thank you for being here. This is really special. This is really wonderful. I was telling some people, all I did today was cry and post to social media. So it means a lot that you're here. And thank you for doing this with me, Isle, and thank you for hosting Books Are Magic. All right, I'm going to start by just reading a little bit from near the beginning of the book. This is a scene where Marissa, the mother, tells Kathleen, her daughter, that she wants a bachelorette party. And they're at dinner with her mother's new fiance, Brian, who is a tech entrepreneur. And Kathleen has not really had a lot of interaction with Brian, so they're still a little bit strangers. That night, Marissa pointed her chopsticks at me, the ends doused in black bean garlic sauce. You need to start planning my party. Brian was staying over again, which meant we were eating at the table. It was a tight fit in the kitchen nook, elbow brushing elbow. A frustratingly competent cook, he'd made dinner, and now the demolished fish lay in tatters of flaking meat. The tablecloth was meant for picnicking, with its waxed surface and red check pattern, and our paper napkins had been saved from takeout orders. Familiar details I wouldn't have noted except for Brian's intrusion. What party? She probed the fish, came away with a greased morsel. You know, the bachelorette party. She pronounced the phrase in careful English. I laughed. You want to have a bachelorette party? I passed a look of incredulity to Brian, who did not return it. He was beaming at his fiancée, ruffling the fish with his chopsticks. Why not? She sat up straighter. La, why? I do it all the time. I want to go to Vegas. I plucked a filament of bone out of my mouth. Just because white people go to Vegas for the bachelorette parties doesn't mean you have to. I hadn't forgiven her for my miserable morning. Her mom had made her go on a jog and she puked because she was so hungover. Don't you think you're past that point? And what would you even do there? Not drink, of course. Oh, there's plenty to do, Brian chimed in. You can hit the casinos, see a show. I resented him for his graciousness, but I knew it was true. Vegas had been something of a family tradition with Papa, who had taken us not long after we'd arrived from Shanghai. He'd been in America for 2 years then, and he introduced us to the most American place he knew, a mirage of the West with its unctuous neon lights and the pervasive whisper of cash. I'd been so young. In my mind, it was like an amusement park, the ersatz halls of Caesar's Palace, which sounded so grand in Mandarin, Kai Sa Gong, and its ceilings painted like a storybook sky. The fountains reeked of chlorine and were glutted with coins. I had photos of myself as a toddler sporting a bowl cut and a fanny pack, making a peace sign next to the camels of the Sahara Desert, so frequently repainted that their bodies sagged with color. We didn't have any other family, so we went there for Christmas too, posing next to hotel lobby trees and their attendant piles of empty boxes wrapped in festive paper. Even back then, I sensed something counterfeit about our holidays. Once I'd seen an off-duty Santa smoking a cigarette by a chain-link fence, dozens of cards advertising call girls tucked in the steel lattice like lewd wallpaper. After the divorce, after my mother found out about my father's Xiao Lao Po, his little wife, we never went back. Maybe a girls' trip would be her way of reclaiming the city, asserting her triumph over the past. The thought depressed me, which made me feel meaner. I didn't have a real wedding the first time, my mother continued. It was bizarre, her entreaty, as though she were a child desperate to attend a sleepover or have a toy. I want to do it the right way. Mama and Papa had met in a doctor's office in Shanghai. She was taking my father, my Waikong, to get his kidney stones treated. He was bringing his sister in for an ear infection. Lanky and gregarious with incendiary ideas about democracy, my father stood in blazing contrast to the suitors my mother had endured at her parents' bidding. But his was a poor and provincial background. His folks were rural Raitiren who'd found their footing in Shanghai as a school teacher and a factory worker during the Cultural Revolution, while my mother's family had risen in status thanks to Waigong's military education and post and submarine research. So they conducted a furtive love. They wrote letters on thin sheets of rice paper. They met at noodle stands between their college campuses and lurched down dappled streets with my mother standing on the back pegs of his bike, skirt rippling around her shape. The honeyed musk of Bailanhua still made Mama nostalgic for the creamy buds he would buy to pin to her blouse, the street peddlers peeling back the cloth on the wicker baskets so that she could choose the most luscious floret. Waipo and Waigong eventually sniffed out the romance, and my grandfather staged a half-hearted hunger strike, but by then it was too late. I was already a curl of flesh in my mother's womb. Baba had long ago married his Shalapo, and now he and Leslie lived in Pasadena. They had no children, though not for the lack of trying. We spoke here and there on the phone, careful not to disrupt the polite scrim we'd erected between us. "This is good news," he'd said about Marissa's engagement. "Happy news." And I took his words at face value because it was too exhausting to do otherwise. Growing up, though, I'd always burrowed close to him, the more affectionate parent whose heavy breath felt like a benediction as he read me stories about the Monkey King and his magnificent adventures. When Papa left, my mother retreated into a private chamber of grief. In college, when I'd read about Mary Carlson's research in a Romanian orphanage, how a lack of touch made the children rock listlessly, rendered them silent and strange, I wondered whether the loss of tenderness could have stunted my growth somehow. Nowadays, doctors call this a failure to thrive. At my age, however, that would have been a hyperbolic diagnosis. It was more likely that the inexplicable flares of anger I felt towards my mother were just adolescent angst. But I'd never stopped studying touch, perhaps trying to understand my sense of deprivation, although I'd wandered into a suffocating, theoretical thicket instead of getting closer to the truth. "Nothing wrong with wanting bells and whistles," said Brian. I watched him suck his teeth and wondered what it was about him that resuscitated my mother after all my years of looking after her. What refulgent love for him And where was that light for me? I guess it would be fun, I relented. Maybe there was something to learn from Brian. Maybe instead of dwelling on my resentment, I could get back to what I had wanted all along, which was to make Marissa happy, which was, in other words, to feel like an adequate daughter.
Amazing. That's so great. Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you.
Let's talk about touch. So this book it's interesting because I see so much like desire and intimacy in this novel, but it's not the sort of like types of desire that we normally get like in books, right? It's not like overly sexual or something like that, but the sort of grounded idea of like the power of touch. So you have like the cuddling that Kathleen is doing, as you were talking about it just now, like relationship to touch to her parents. So can you just talk about that? Like what sort of drew you to want to write about this sort of type of physical intimacy that might not really get the spotlight that it normally does in novels?
Yes. I'm trying to think of when touch really entered the book in a real way, and I think it has to be probably when I was in grad school and I was looking up summer jobs, and there was a call for professional cuddlers at this clinic that was opening up in Maryland. I was living in Baltimore at the time, and I didn't end up going for it. I ended up being a reader for a blind attorney, which was also interesting and gave me material, but that's not why I did it.
That's book two.
I mean,
Yeah.
everything I do is kind of for material in some way. But I didn't end up applying for it, but I did. That kind of burrowed into my head, and for some reason, when I started writing Kathleen and Marissa, I gave it to Kathleen to explore, and I think subconsciously I knew it was a good way for her to think about connection and intimacy and love and authenticity, because that's something that she's really grappling with in her life. She's fallen off this academic track. She's broken up with someone that she thought she was going to be with for the rest of her life. She thought she knew her mother. She comes back, she realized her mother, this version of her mother that she knows, is like no longer there. So she's feeling really unmoored. And so touch really felt like a pregnant metaphor to start to explore some of these ideas. And I mean, I think it's really reflected in our language, right? When you think of someone being really touchy, or when you keep in touch, or when someone's out of touch, a lot of our language is grounded in the physical. When you feel something out, or you get the warm and fuzzies.
Yeah, fuzzy sounds like touch. Yeah.
Fuzzy's touch. Fuzzy's tactile.
Yeah. No, I love that, right? And I love that you started to talk about like Kathleen's relationship to intimacy. And that I think is what's really fascinating in this. And you touched on it a little bit, touched on it. Yeah. Count them. Does someone have a clicker? Can we get like how many touches we say tonight? The counterfeit, the real, the authentic, I think is something that's coming up a lot in this book, right? Like both through how you write about Vegas and later on about like real relationships versus fake relationships. Before I get to that though, I want to think more broadly about like what is Kathleen's relationship to like authentic intimacy versus like the counterfeit intimacy that she might have had like with her mom previously, or what she seems to be having with her at the beginning of the book. So can you talk about like why Kathleen is so drawn towards those deeper forms of intimacy?
What is authentic intimacy? I don't know if it actually exists, or for Kathleen if it actually exists, because there's always going to be these layers. You have the action, right? And then you have, if it's between two people, you have the action of intimacy, whatever it may be. And then you have like one person's perception of it, and then you have the other person's perception of it, and then you have all these layers of like, what are the politics of it? In the case of like Midas Touch and the Cuddle Clinic, you're paying for it. But I don't know, even in like the context of dating, like there's always going to be some sort of power dynamic. I feel like there's always going to be someone who is more invested. And how do you ever like unravel any of that? So I think that's what Kathleen is sort of grappling with, especially on the heels of this relationship, this really big relationship in her life ending. She was like, how much of that was authentic? how much did I even want to be in it? And maybe I was just like sort of in it because of momentum or because of all the hooks that we'd sunk into each other.
Yeah, I mean, that brings me, I wanted to talk about how you write about love and heartbreak in this book, which I think is like it's so good. It's amazing. Like how Jenny captures it is so incredible. And I want to actually, I shouldn't read it. You should read it because it's your book.
You should read it.
Okay, why not? Yeah, I'll do my best Jenny impression. The truth was, my body had sensed the relationship straining before the breakup. Oren and I had stopped touching each other. The sex was still there, but not the palm caressing my lower back as he passed me in the kitchen, not the sardine squeeze of our bodies stretched across the couch. We fell asleep with just our ankles intertwined, and I would wake up huddled on one side with the covers while he lay exposed in the dark. These were inches that felt like miles, the negative space between us like runes we refused to decipher. And how you write about sort of the slow collapse of this relationship, I think is like done so well, right? Like I was moved throughout about the sort of dual consciousness that's or like the dual states that occur like during heartbreak, right? Like disassociating when like love, grief, you're like in the world and then you're just back in the place of like what you have lost. More craft-wise, can you talk about like how you capture that on the page? Because I think there's another way to write this book that is very like intensely like romantic, but this isn't doing that. I think you're capturing the details really well. So can you talk about how you did that, what your aims were in doing that?
I'll try.
Yeah.
Well, I think first of all, I'm very masterful at heartbreak. Not that I'm
in life or write it like
in life, like that's
okay.
You know, I shouldn't say masterful. I'm not good at it. It's just happened to me a lot. So I know a lot of like the source material, and I can draw from that. Yeah, heartbreak is so straight. I mean, I feel like I've been talking about this a lot, but it's a weird grief because it's not like any other type of grief or loss where other people also have, like when someone dies, right? Everyone is mourning that person, and we understand that that person is no longer there. But when a romantic relationship ends, you know, most of the time both parties are still there, but like the third entity that you created is the thing that is lost, and no one understands that that person is lost or that thing or that being, except for you and the person that you're not allowed to talk to. So it's a weird limbo, and I think that absence is sort of where I try to tunnel into where Kathleen's mind is, right? There's this moment in the book on the morning where she's jogging and pukes, like these two people ride by on their bikes, and it's like a fleeting moment where they're, you know, like kind of like shouting at each other, just going on a bike ride somewhere, and it's like that little mundane moment that she sees like, oh, that's something that I used to have, or I see their love, and it just pronounces that absence for her. I feel like that's where a lot of heartbreak or grief can kind of live, in that moment where you realize what's missing. Another moment is like when she's at a house party, right, and she sees her high school boyfriend is now dating her best friend, but it's cool.
It's totally
kind
cool.
of
Totally
cool.
Yeah, no.
We've talked about it.
Yeah.
But she sees them kind of interacting across the room, and like there's the easy way that, like, you know, when you're like talking in a group with someone you're dating or someone you're in love with, you kind of just like kind of touch each other. There's this like unthought of choreography, and she also sees that, going back to touch, and like realizes, oh, I didn't even realize that was a thing that was such a nurturing cocoon in my life that's now been ripped away. So yeah, I think it was all very much rooted in like what's missing and what she's yearning for, and also just like this absence of knowledge. And not to get into it too much, but like social media, I feel like now is like a very good conduit of that, right? Of like amplifying the thing that you are not privy to anymore.
Yeah. I'm here for if you have takes about social media. No, let's.
It's not a hot take. It's
Yeah.
just a very normie take of like social media makes it very hard to like forget your ex.
Yeah. That's on video. Yeah, you heard.
Yeah,
Yeah.
hopefully they're not watching.
Yeah. No, we've locked out your exes from
Perfect.
Yeah, okay, great. I mean, there's absence all over this book, though, right? Like, I mean, there's like Oren, the ex, who sort of like just hovers around, like the father, Baba, like Phil, who Kathleen like works with at Midas Touch, and there's even like I got a sense of absence of like Marissa, like the version of her that Kathleen grew up with seems sort of gone, right? And like how trauma has shaped her. So can you talk about how Kathleen is sort of shaped by these other absences throughout her life? Like instead of just like the Oren absence, like what was so interesting about speaking about it or writing about a character who's shaped by all these absences?
I mean, for Kathleen, I feel like her origin story a little bit is when Papa leaves the family. And she's quite young. She's like 7 or 8. And suddenly she's thrown into this role of caretaker for her mom. And Papa before was always sort of like the more grounding parent in her life. He's just more tender. He's more forthcoming. And both people in the family, she and her mother, were both sort of oriented towards him and his warmth. And when he leaves, they kind of are left together to fend for themselves. And so that's sort of the central absence of her life. And I think she's like looking for that sort of warmth and comfort and stability again in many of her relationships, for better or for worse. You know, trying to recreate it with her mother to mixed results, but also her friendships, and her own relationships, and later you'll see like her cuddle clients. But I think she's always trying to figure out how to get back into that sense of stability, because it's the way that she's always known. That's the way that she's always like formed an opinion on herself. And what I hope for Kathleen is sort of realize at the end, by ripping all this context away and by like forcing her into these very uncomfortable situations of loss, is that like without the context or without the other person as a foil, what do you have to do to sort of determine who you are to yourself? Can you define yourself and find a path for yourself, not as a negative of someone else or as a mirror image of someone else?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
You passed the test. Yeah. Like, yeah. There are no grades. But I mean, what that
grade motivated.
A plus. Yeah. I mean, what that reminds me of, and thinking about like the relationships that she has to her friends is really interesting. There's like LB, the like high school friend, college friend, or like
middle school.
Okay, yeah, even
remember.
Yeah, yeah.
I think middle school.
Yeah. So that sort of foundation of friendship and like relationship, how it's played against like Kathleen's relationship to her mom, and I was really curious about those two sort of connections that occur in this book, or like the two sort of parallel foundations between like friendship and family. And can you talk about the contrast that you made between the two of them? Like what interested you in writing about friends versus family, and like what do you see as like how they shape Kathleen in this book?
Yeah. LB was really fun to write. First of all, I just really wanted a character whose name was 2 initials, because I thought that was really cool. You gotta amuse yourself somehow. Like this is many years.
You gotta put jokes in.
In. No one, it was like abuses no one but me. But her name is LB. And she, I mean, I love Friends as a chosen family trope, and I think it's really revealing of a character to see who they've chosen to surround themselves with, because these are the people that she thinks actually define her and understand her. And I mean, there couldn't be 2 more different people probably than LB and Marissa. The central thing I also wanted to sort of illustrate with Marissa as, a mother-daughter dynamic is that not only are they kind of divided by this generational divide and all the fraught things that come with mother-daughter dynamics and trying to teach the next generation how to kind of conform to this very oppressive idea of womanhood and femmehood. Beyond that, for them, there's the additional layer of like they've immigrated, and so for Kathleen, she doesn't have a lot of the same like cultural history that her mom grew up in. She doesn't understand those values. She doesn't understand those worldviews. And so her relationship with Marissa is very much like, why won't you accept me? Why won't you love me? Why won't you believe that I know what I'm doing? And very much not understanding where her mother is coming from, and vice versa. Versus for LB, right, this is someone that she's grown up with, so they have all that context together. And so I wanted for them to have this sort of language that felt really easy. And I forget, my friend put it this way about someone. It's like when you meet someone and they're on the same internet, like there's a lot you don't have to explain. And so I wanted her to have that environment where she's just very easy and can be herself, and kind of let loose a little bit. I mean, LB is a little bit of a troublemaker, and pushes Kathleen into sometimes dicey territory.
Yeah, and that's so really important too, right?
It's
and like
a very important factor of friendship, that they help you make bad decisions.
yeah, that's why we have friends.
This is why you're my friend. Just,
yeah, exactly.
You've never pressured me into any sort of bad decision.
The night is young. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking too about how, like, the different worlds that Kathleen is populating, like, between, like, her, like, I guess professional self, you can say too. So, like, how do you see her being all of these different people? Like, what is, like, the constellation? It's interesting because I see her as almost a caretaker for Marissa sometimes as well, even though they have a very, like, Marissa cares through, like, criticism, right? Like, a lot of times, right? Like, comparing her to, like, cousins and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
But Kathleen has been a caretaker for her and then takes on that role later in life. And it seems almost like, can you talk about maybe the threat of caretaking in this book? Because it ends up being, for Kathleen, like, kind of a threat by the end of the book. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, she was thrown into this very young role of caretaker for her mom, after this rupture in the family. And Marissa kind of goes off the deep end and finds solace in drinking and working all these different gigs. And, she's in a very dark place. And Kathleen, is a caretaker, but also isn't that great at it. She's a kid. And so she's trying to take care of her mom and, like, does the minimum of, like, if you're puking in the bathroom, like, I'm going to, like, help you do that. But she also, like, caretakes in terms of, like, I'm just going to excel and, like, leave the house. So, like, you see her, like, do every extracurricular ever. And so it's sort of this, like, double-edged sword of, like, well, I'm not there for you, but you also can't be mad at me because I'm doing I'm doing the thing that you came to the States to do. So she's a caretaker in that sense. And she's also sort of, like, pruning and trying to take care of this relationship with Oren, this romantic relationship with Oren that ends up falling apart. And then she, goes into the role of cuddling, as we've been talking about, and that's very much in the realm of caretaking. And so what I learned about touch is in my research is that, it's not just like an extra, it's not just a cherry on top. It's like a very biologically rooted need. It helps regulate your heart rate. It lowers your cortisol levels, which lowers stress, which boosts your immunity. It helps you sleep. It lowers anxiety. They've seen that it, doubles the rate of growth in infants in the NICU, just all across the board. It's really instrumental in your health and wellness. And so she's really interested in this clinic because it, offers this kind of caretaking that I think she actually just wants, but she doesn't know how to seek it out, or is maybe a little too avoidant to seek it out. And it's also an interesting way for her to think about her research. So before this book starts, she was doing her PhD in cognitive psychology, studying the science of haptics, which is the science of touch. So it's in this very, like, cerebral, removed intellectual plane that she's thinking about touch. And mine is touch. The cuddle clinic is the exact opposite, where she's, stepping in and really pressing her body fully against someone else's. And learns to be a caretaker in that sense, also to mix results, because she has a hard time separating intimacy and emotion, which, can't fault her. I think those are intertwined in many realms.
Yeah, who hasn't? Yeah.
Who hasn't?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I love that too, of like almost like that metaphor for like writing even, right? Of like, you know, either being like sort of in the like just thinking about things and then actually experiencing the thing, and like the confusion that comes out of like when those things are eventually like combined with each other. I think comes across so well, right? Like when like you think you're an expert in something and then you like do the like on the ground version of it, and it's like, oh, this is much harder than I thought it was. Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to. Yeah, this is. I feel like it's connected to the question about like authentic intimacy.
Yeah.
Because it's really just hard to understand. At least maybe this is just me. It's really hard to understand what's happening when you're in it. And so like the questions of authenticity or like what's real or what's genuine are just so hard to parse because you know you're just very reactive in a moment and then you sort of like form narratives about it, but that's already retroactive.
Yeah, and you can't stop and be like, is this real?
Is this real?
Yeah, is that? Yeah.
Are you feeling what I'm feeling?
Staring into someone's eyes, is this
Yeah.
real? Yeah, a very normal question to ask. So I want to think too, like sort of connected to that. So there's this app called Wayfinder, which is how Brian gets all of his money, which essentially shows someone how to get to point A to point B with the understanding that you might find some like hidden gems on the way, right? Do you want to actually describe Wayfinder better than me?
You did a great job, but it's basically that. It's Wayfinder with no E. It's an app. It is meant to like corral people into, you know, going out of their way. Like I imagine this interface, no one steal this, please. Or do it and then like, I don't know, I get money from it. But
you're on video, it's recorded.
Yeah.
If it happens. Yeah, this is
right,
your patent.
this is patented.
Yeah.
I imagine like you're walking around and there's like some sort of UI that's like, if you go here, you'll get, you know, $10 off your slushie. And so it'll sort of like lasso people in real time into basically buying things.
Yeah. So I was curious what this app sort of says about the role of like spontaneity and how we actually move through the world. I see it as like the antithesis of like how we actually move through life in the way that so many like tech things actually make harder things that they're supposed to make easier, right? Like we don't simply go from one point to another. We like in real life, we dodge, we stumble, we sit on the ground, we cry. And I'm wondering how the novel is sort of like a rejection of like the easy point A to B, especially Kathleen, right? Who is this person who has such a clear point A to B sort of set up for her. And then her life is sort of a rejection of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I wasn't thinking of that at all, but it works out. I mean,
Yeah.
Wayfinder is this, you know, this idealized version of being in the world, and its whole tagline is like, you know, it's helping you save money and helping you discover the neighborhood, and for businesses it's meant to be like you'll bring foot traffic into your business, and it's meant to like enliven neighborhoods that way. But you know, Kathleen thinks this in the book too, right? But it's sort of just like glorified gentrification. But yeah, there's this idea, I think, that is not just in tech, but is, you know, this is the thing we're talking about. There's this idea that you can optimize your life. I mean, everything is about saving time, doing things more efficiently, doing things more creatively or robustly. And I mean, there's a way that you optimize like all the magic out of your life, because you see, you know, Kathleen in this moment sort of ricocheting from thing to thing. And that's, you know, these sort of collisions are what's helping her realize what she needs to do next. Like if she had just done the neat thing, which is what she was already doing, right? Of like earning her PhD in haptics and like marrying this guy when this relationship is like good enough, and doing all the things that she's supposed to do on this timeline that is, you know, societally, what's it called?
Condoned.
Stamped, condoned. You know, that would have been very boring for her, and she maybe wouldn't have been very happy, and she probably would have never done the work with Marissa that they now do by the end of the book. Not that it's a neat ending, but they start to open up their narratives about each other. And it's through her collisions of the book of like, oh, I'm going to be swiping on an app, and what is this cuddle clinic, and maybe I'll do it, and God, this is a bad idea, but I'm going to do it anyway. Like, you see her sort of like bumbling through these bad decisions that get her to a place of better understanding. Like the Chicks song, she needed room to make a big mistake. And I feel like if you're like constantly going from point A to B, then like why be born at all? You're just like on a track.
Yeah, because B is just death.
Yeah.
That's we know what B is.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's so interesting because like everyone in the book, I think, is like becomes human through the failure to optimize, right? Like Marissa.
I love that.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna write it down.
Yeah.
I'm gonna use that in interviews. What was it again?
They become human through the failure to optimize.
Yes.
Okay, everybody repeat it. We'll get a chant going. Because like Marissa's the same way, right? Like, and she's in this relationship that is like seems so much like actually happier for her, right? And she seems like more alive in a lot of ways. And that it's funny that Kathleen sort of can't accept that at the beginning because it isn't like an optimized relationship, right? And I think oftentimes like with our parents, it's like we don't optimize, but they should, right? Like, and I think that's really amazing, right? And it's like only when it becomes messy between the two of them do they actually like have a relationship. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Kathleen feels a lot of resentment for her mom feeling happy in a strange way. She loves her mother and she wants her to be happy and is joyful for her. But she also feels this, and we heard that a little bit in the part I read, but she also feels not good enough, or like, why wasn't I the thing to lift you or motivate you out of that place? And who is this Brian guy, and why is he the one to kind of sweep you off your feet? Like, what does he have, or what does he mean to you that I don't? And so in that way, she is trying to optimize their relationship back to this like more neat narrative of like the mother who will do anything for her child, and like and that's not really the case for Marissa. Like Marissa, actually, for her, like she's number one, and that's we demonize a lot of mothers for doing that, for putting themselves first.
Yeah. So I'm gonna ask one more question, and then we're gonna go to the audience. So what drew you to rat influencers?
Thank you for asking that question. Gosh. So in the book, there's a rat named Milo who her ex-boyfriend's roommate is trying to make famous on Instagram. And I've gotten the handle. I haven't done anything with it. I had this idea way before. Like,
pull out your phones right now and go tell. Yeah.
There's nothing on it. I haven't posted it, but it's Meet Milo the rat, and I was like, ooh, what if I like built up this rat Instagram, and like that was my marketing campaign for the book. But then I was like, I don't have any. Then I would have to go to like stock images and get photos of rats to populate it. I used to live in a co-op of 126 people in college. This is sort of what Dolly's is based on in the book, the co-op. And we weren't allowed to have warm-blooded pets, but a lot of people had rats because they were small and easy to conceal. And, smart and had great personalities, and didn't live that long. So I was around a lot of rats.
A nice 4-year animal.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like a small, like you don't want to go too big, like too much responsibility. So I was around a lot of rats, and it was also, then I started writing. I mean, this was way back, like 2015, 2016, before Instagram influencers were really a thing. So I was like really fascinated by the idea that you could brand yourself and put it on Instagram and make money off it. Now it seems like the most basic thing, but I swear when I started writing this book, it wasn't that prevalent, and it was fascinating. So I was like, okay, well, how can we put these two things that I'm interested in together? And how can we make it like a little goofy and a little like doomed from the start, because again, your influencer's only going to live like a couple of years.
Amazing. All right. I still say go to Instagram, meet Milo the Rat. Is that it?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Force Jenny to populate that page. Do you have some questions from the audience? Yeah.
Hi, Jenny.
Hi.
I was just curious to hear a little bit more about like how the book evolved over time. I know you didn't start with the touch aspect as much, and just would love to hear more about like what the journey of it was like.
So the question is, how did the book evolve over time? What was the journey of it like?
It was such a long journey. The central characters were still there. Kathleen and Marissa were at the core. But in the same way that I've grown up with the book, like the characters really grew up. In the first draft, they were just out of college. The fact that her best friend is dating her ex was much more hot and much more present. Not hot like, ooh, that's so hot, but more like just like hot to the touch, more just alive. And, you know, Baba was a lot more around. Like there were more scenes with her struggling with him. Yeah, so in a way it was just a lot more like young. It was a lot younger. The stakes weren't figured out yet. It was a lot messier. There was just too much going on. And so in later drafts, they got older. They're in grad school. The stakes are higher. And I kind of just like let Baba go into the background because it felt like it was just muddling what was actually going on in her life. But yeah, so much change. I probably wrote this book 10 times.
Damn.
8 to 10 times.
Yeah, the number's going down. Yeah.
Well, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds right though.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, some of them are like, sometimes the draft, like the changes towards the end weren't as drastic as
sure,
in the
yeah.
beginning. But in the beginning, a lot changed. A lot of scenes are just dumped. You keep them because you're like, maybe they'll be useful later, but they never will.
No.
And then like just the feeling of deleting a whole chapter is just like devastating, but you have to do it. I'm
Yeah,
sure
it's
you've done.
I've never deleted anything. Yeah. No. Other questions? Yeah. Yeah.
In your recent article for Esquire, you spoke about, I guess, working as a professional co-author, and I'm just curious to know, like, you spoke a lot about like the dangers of doing that and going out and those dangers of sex work and escorting it. Like, is that touched upon at all?
So recently, Jenny wrote an excellent piece in Esquire about working as a professional cuddler. And so can you talk a little bit about the dangers of that, if that's touched on in the book, how it relates to the novel?
Yeah, absolutely. I started professional cuddling myself when I had a gap in my employment. And I was like, oh, now I have time to explore this. And I feel like I did the research a little bit backwards. I mean, I had hired folks before and I'd done a lot of like reading papers and interviewing about it, but I actually hadn't done it myself. And so it was sort of like I was experiencing it through Kathleen. And then I was like, then I'm going to do it. And then I kind of let that experience go back, like reflect back on Kathleen's experiences with her clients and encounters with her clients. But yeah, absolutely. Let me step back and say, well, I think it's a type of care and a type of healthcare that there really isn't infrastructure for here that we desperately need for many reasons. You can think of like elders who are lonely. You can think of like just the way that the pandemic has forced us apart. You can think of the way that like a lot of straight men are not socialized to seek platonic touch, and it's just very harmful. But there's not really a well organized way to do it. So the site I use is cuddlecomfort.com, which is like maybe a step above Craigslist in terms of sketchiness. And so you have to do a lot of screening. And I would say like 99.99 of the people who reached out through that site like shot themselves in the foot of just like, okay, you are not the right person for me to see. It's just very clear. It's actually kind of like strikingly clear like how easy the weeding out process is. They kind of announce themselves like, I'm a creep. And you know, and I found like, but you know, what I loved when it was good was like the work of like setting up a framework and trying to understand like, why is this something that you want, and have you had any experience with it, and what are your thoughts about it, how did you find out about it. You know, going through like some exercises around consent and like practicing saying no, and practicing like I actually don't want to be touched that way. Just setting up this boundary and this space where you can have this sort of like platonic, intimate experience was really gratifying. But there was always that, you know, element of danger there. I mean, someone came to my apartment and he'd made empanadas and they were really good, and I took a bite and then just this idea, just like thought flashed through my head of like, oh no, what if it's drugged? I'm such an idiot. They're not drugged, they're very good. But like that is a danger, and I was like, oh my god, I could just be like killed here. But yeah, so there's a lot of danger involved, but I would say there's a lot of danger involved in, you know, being a woman and just walking around. So it's not, you don't have to go to cuddling to be in danger. And I tried to give a lot of those insights to Kathleen also.
Maybe one more question? Yeah, Mateo.
This might be a little cliche, but what's your writing routine?
What's my writing routine?
What's the writing routine?
I don't have a writing routine. I will say I mostly write in the afternoons. I'll mostly write outside the house. A lot of this was done like, actually in nights. I wrote a lot like after work for like an hour or so. I have like many routines that work for like a couple weeks and then they don't work anymore. So one of them was like after work I would come home and I would have an edible, and then I would just like write until I started feeling the edible, which is like when I started liking the writing, which was like, no, this is trying to stop. Other times, like it would be, I love like Saturday afternoons, just like posted up 5-6 hours at a cafe. Because I'm not good at writing. I really need like a lot of time and space to get into it. The first couple hours are just me like thinking about writing. Then I'll
Waiting for the
write.
edible to hit.
Waiting for the edible to hit.
Yeah.
What are some other routines? Sometimes I'll like, if it's getting too like, sometimes it feels like there's too much pressure and I'll just write an email draft. And I feel like that's been helpful because I'm like, it's just an email draft. Like, what could it hurt? And then I'll just port that over to the document. Do I have any more? Yeah, but I wish I had a more established routine, like a more like time to write.
I think that's even better than one routine is you just gave us like 4. So that's, yeah. Thank you so much, Jenny. This was wonderful. Thank you everyone for coming out.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you all so much for coming out tonight, and thanks to everyone who asked questions. As I mentioned a bit earlier ago, Jenny will be signing and personalizing books. My coworker Amali is pointing to that little cubby right now. It's a bit hidden, but I swear it's there. And we just ask that you line up along this center aisle so the staff and I can begin breaking down the books, not the books, the chairs. And then if you need a bathroom, there is one right to the moleskins on your right. Okay, that's it. Let's give these two one round of applause.
Yeah, that was amazing. You did so good.